Hi, in this video we're going to learn about how to interpret a research journal article. In other words, we're going to look at how research articles are typically structured, and we're also going to talk about what information from a journal article like this one would be appropriate to cite in a paper like your key assessment paper in this class, and also what information from a research journal article that you really shouldn't be citing in your own paper. So to give you a little bit of background, I chose a paper that I co-authored for the purpose of creating this video because I'm really familiar with it. Also, it has a really catchy title. So to give you a sense of what this journal article is all about and what the study is all about, my colleague Sue Kimmel and I were very interested in learning what pre-service teachers and school librarians thought about a very controversial children's book called The Higher Power of Lucky. We were really interested in finding out why these pre-service educators would preemptively censor The Higher Power of Lucky. So just to give you a little bit of background, preemptive censorship occurs when educators and librarians and really anybody who has responsibility for placing books in children's hands, when they decide not to use a particular book because they're afraid of what parents might think, they're worried about the controversy the book might elicit, they don't like the ideas contained in the book, they think the book is not very good. Those are all different reasons why educators engage in preemptive censorship. So preemptive censorship has the effect of reducing children's access to a variety of literature. So it's very problematic. So to give you a little bit of context about the research that this article describes, that's it in a nutshell. So research articles typically start with an abstract. An abstract is simply a summary, an overview of what the article is all about. An abstract is really useful to you as somebody who is deciding, is this article a good fit for my topic that I'm researching? Read the abstract first and see if it talks about the concepts that you want it to. See if it's a good match. If it's not, then maybe you move along to the next article in your search result. So the introduction of a research article typically introduces the topic or the problem that's being investigated in the research study. So in this particular article, my co-author and I talked about this children's book, The Higher Power of Lucky, and how it elicited all these reactions from school librarians. Like so many librarians said, I would never use this book and put it in my school collection because it has the word scrotum on the first page. However, what's really interesting is that this book won the Newbery Medal, which is considered to be one of the most prestigious of children's book awards in the United States. So even though this book won what's considered to be like the prize of all prizes in children's literature, some librarians said that they wouldn't use it because it has this word scrotum on the first page, hence the title of the article. And in this introduction, we also talk about how those reactions to this book, The Higher Power of Lucky, are indicative of a bigger trend of preemptive censorship among educators and school librarians. And in this introduction, we also talk about the reasons why we think that that's so problematic, how it undermines professional values related to intellectual freedom and children's right to read, and so forth. So you'll notice in the introduction, we're citing a lot of literature, a lot of scholarship, things other people have written about. So when you write an introduction, with a research article, that's typically what you do. You draw from other sources to make your case that, hey, this issue that I'm so passionate about that I'm studying actually matters. So other people said so. So you're citing a lot of scholarship in the introduction. The introduction of an article also typically tells about the purpose of the study that's being described in the article. So in this particular article, we have a section called Purpose of the Study. So that way readers of this article are crystal clear on why we're doing this study, why it matters, why we think it's significant, and so forth. So those are typically features that you are going to find in the introduction of an article. And our introduction is relatively short. It's just about 2 pages. So something to keep in mind. So if you are looking at an article like this one, or really any research article, for your key assessment paper, you should not be citing information that you find in the paper's introduction. Because as I've just explained, the introduction of the paper is very much based on other scholarship. You see all the citations that we have in this part of the paper. Unless you have actually read the sources that are being cited in a paper's introduction, you should not be citing them. Because now that I have written this paper and I looked at this scholarship myself, I read it, what I'm communicating here is now a secondary source. I read primary sources, now they become secondary sources. In your paper, you really shouldn't be citing secondary sources. So Just as a general rule of thumb for your key assessment paper, please do not cite information that you find in an article's introduction unless you go hunt down the source that's cited in the introduction. It's really not appropriate to cite. So the next section that we typically see in the research journal article might be called a literature review, or it could be called conceptual framework, it could be called theoretical perspectives. Those differ a little bit, but that's beyond the scope of this particular video. You'll probably get a sense of what those differences are as you move along in the program and you take some of your research courses. In this particular article, we call this section theoretical perspectives. So here my co-author and I talked about what sorts of theories have influenced our understanding of censorship and preemptive censorship in particular. And we also articulate the professional values that we ascribe to as educators ourselves. We believe very strongly in children's right to read and their intellectual freedom. So that's something, we made our stance very clear in this theoretical perspective section of the paper. So once again, you can see that we are citing a lot of other sources here. We actually went and we read these sources. So now these sources as they appear in my paper here, these are secondary sources now if you're reading this particular article, right? So just like with the introduction, you really should not be citing information from a literature review, a conceptual framework, or the theoretical perspectives section of the paper, unless you go find the sources on your own and you actually read them for yourself. You should not be citing anything that comes from this section of the paper. So the methods section of the paper describes the research methodology that we use to come up with the findings that we describe later on in the paper. So this section, right now, you're in your first semester of a graduate program. The methods section might seem a little fuzzy until you become more familiar with different types of research methods. And that's okay. We just ask that you read through it and do your best. As you move through the program, you'll certainly be in a better position to critique and evaluate the quality of the methodology that's used in a research study. But for now, just go ahead and read it and try to become familiar with different types of research methodologies. Typically, you would not cite anything from the methods section when you are writing your key assessment paper for the purpose of this course. Later on, as you move through the program and you become more familiar with research methodologies, you might be, citing information from the methods section of another paper, but that's probably beyond the scope of what we need to do in this class this summer for the sake of your key assessment. So the findings section of a research article, sometimes this is also called results, but the research that I did here is qualitative research. So we researched people's thoughts and feelings. It's qualitative research. Typically in a qualitative research article, this section is called findings. If you are reading an article that uses quantitative methodology, like they're using a statistical procedure to communicate the results, that section is called results instead of findings. But either way, we're talking about like what did the researcher discover as a result of doing this research study. So that's what the findings section is all about. So in this section of the paper, we talk about some of the patterns we noticed as our students discussed why they would or would not use the book The Higher Power of Lucky in an elementary or middle school setting. So we organize this section of our paper according to themes. So for example, our participants in the research study talked about who decides what children should read, what is appropriate reading for children and what is not. You get the idea. So when you are writing a paper like your key assessment paper, it's okay to cite the findings of a research article. So now this section of the paper, this is original work. This is something that I came up with in my co-author as we did our research. This section of our paper is empirical research. It's a primary source. So if there was a research finding here that was relevant to the paper that you're writing, it would be appropriate to cite from the findings section of the paper. All right, it's just not appropriate to cite from the introduction or the literature review, but the findings is fair game. All right, so after the findings, we typically see a section called discussion. So the discussion section typically summarizes some of the main ideas from the research findings. It also talks about like what do these findings really mean in the broader context. Oftentimes, the discussion section will also talk about the research findings and how they relate to previous research findings. Do the current findings either refute or corroborate what other researchers have discovered In this case, with this article, we found that a lot of the themes that we identified in our study corroborated very nicely with other research studies we've read about why educators engage in preemptive censorship. In this section, we also include some practical implications for teachers, like how not to engage in preemptive censorship, what are some appropriate ways of introducing controversial topics to your students. So oftentimes that discussion section will also have some practical implications as well. Is it okay to cite information from the discussion section? Yes, it is, as long as you're citing information that is the author of the paper's original ideas. So notice that in this discussion section, I am citing other sources because I'm talking about how the findings from my study corroborate what other people have found. So you could cite that as long as you're citing the ideas that I'm saying. Okay, again, you don't want to cite ideas that are secondary sources in this section of the paper. And then finally, most research articles conclude by, well, having a conclusion. So they summarize the significance of the study. Typically speaking, the conclusion is usually short, sometimes one paragraph, sometimes 2 or 3. You could cite information from the conclusion because, again, the conclusion section of the paper often articulates the author of the paper's original ideas. It doesn't include a lot of citations from other sources. So as a general rule of thumb, if it's the author's own findings, the author's own ideas, it's okay to cite in your key assessment paper. If the author of the paper is citing other sources, like in the introduction and the literature review and possibly in some parts of the discussion, not okay to cite. So just keep that rule in mind if you're unclear on what is okay to cite and what is not okay to cite. We have a discussion forum in D2L, so please feel welcome to use that to ask questions, or please feel free to send me an email. Thanks for watching.